The winter of 1945 clung to the shattered edges of Europe like a final dying breath, a season heavy with the weight of collapsing empires and fleeing shadows. In the eastern territories, where forests swallowed roads and war had carved wounds into every abandoned village, a small convoy moved under a sky the color of old iron. Among the prisoners chained inside the rear truck was a man whose name would fade from records almost as quickly as he vanished. He had been known only as Prisoner 239, a designation stamped on a torn card, a number shouted at him more often than any human voice speaking his name. The guards believed he was just another detainee to be moved west before the front lines closed in. Yet there was something about his silence, his posture, his unwavering stare that made even hardened soldiers shift uneasily whenever they passed by him. Rumors spread among the men that 239 had once been an officer, that he'd been involved in something forbidden, something that didn't appear in official paperwork. Some whispered he had been part of a research division in the mountains. Others said he was simply a political prisoner who knew too much. But no one could say for certain, and those who had tried to read his files found entire pages missing, replaced by blank sheets that smelled faintly of burnt edges. As the convoy pushed deeper into the frozen woods, the engine fumes floated like sickly ghosts through the air, mingling with the faint scent of pine sap and distant fire. The war had driven countless people into these forests, and the trees seemed to hold every scream, every order, every muffled confession inside their dark trunks. The road had long ceased to be reliable, now softened by melting snow and pockmarked by artillery scars. The truck jolted violently with each rut, causing the prisoners to sway like a line of hopeless marionettes. Through the canvas-covered opening, a thin draft crept in, touching the prisoners' faces like cold fingers searching for warmth that no longer existed. Prisoner 239 sat near the rear, his wrists bruised from the metal cuffs, his gaze lowered not in defeat, but in profound concentration, as if he were listening to something far beyond the reach of the surrounding world. He had barely spoken during the entire journey, but the men around him felt his presence like a flicker of warmth in the endless cold, unsettling only because warmth had no place here. At times, they caught him studying the guards with a strange mixture of patience and resignation, as though he knew something they didn't, something that awaited them on this road. His boots, cracked and worn at the seams, were the only thing about him that seemed undeniably human, bearing the marks of countless miles and winters. No one could guess that those boots would become the only trace of him ever found. As the convoy approached a narrow bend between two ridges, the wind grew sharper, spiraling through the branches above with the sound of distant whispering. The lead truck honked once, signaling a halt. The brakes hissed, and the convoy shuddered to a stop. The guards climbed out, stamping their feet against the frost. The prisoners shifted uncomfortably, aware that stops rarely meant anything good. One of the guards scanned the tree line with narrowed eyes, commenting softly that he had seen movement among the branches, perhaps a deserter or a wandering civilian. Another muttered that partisans were rumored to be nearby, and this forest had swallowed entire patrols without a sound. The fear was quiet but present, coiling beneath their breath. Inside the truck, prisoner 239 lifted his head slightly, his expression readable. His fellow detainees felt a tremor of unease ripple through them as the guards approached. The moment felt stretched, suspended, as though the woods themselves were watching. A low fog curled along the ground, rising slowly until it blurred the prisoners' boots. It carried with it a faint metallic smell that none of them could identify. Before continuing the slow descent into the darker parts of the journey, Allow me to ask you something in the middle of this tension. From where are you watching this video? Let your presence echo in the comments below. The guards exchanged terse orders and opened the truck's rear door, pulling 2 prisoners out for inspection. 239 remained motionless, his eyes following a stray wisp of fog drifting under the tires. When the guards finally gestured for him to step out, something shifted in the air, a quiet stiffness that made even the wind pause. He rose, slowly, calmly, his movements almost graceful, despite the chains cutting into his skin. One of the guards grabbed his arm roughly, unaware that this brief moment would be the last time any of them would touch him. Once on the ground, 239 scanned the tree line with a gaze that seemed to measure distances and angles, as if mapping an escape route, though he never attempted one. The guards barked questions at him, but he answered none. His silence enraged one of them, who shoved him against the side of the truck. Yet even then, 239's composure didn't break. Instead, he tilted his head slightly toward the forest, as if hearing something no one else could hear. A branch snapped somewhere in the distance too sharply to be the wind. The guards stiffened, rifles lifting instinctively. Another snap, then a faint thud. The forest exhaled a breath colder than the winter itself. A sudden shout from the lead truck called the guards back. They turned away, leaving 239 standing near the fog-laced roadside. For a moment he remained completely still, his silhouette fading slightly into the pale mist. Then, without noise, without struggle, without a single shuffled step that anyone would remember, he was gone. When the guards turned back, he had vanished as though the forest had swallowed him whole. Panic rippled through the convoy. They searched the immediate area, calling out sharply, shining lanterns into the underbrush. The fog thickened, spreading like a curtain, muffling their frantic orders. Dogs were brought from the front vehicle, barking wildly as their leashes pulled taut toward the trees. But they did not follow a trail. Instead, they circled, whining and cowering, refusing to move forward as if something unseen blocked their path. When dawn finally broke, its light weak and sickly, the guards found only one thing at the edge of the woods. Lying neatly beside a patch of disturbed earth were 239's boots, still warm to the touch, the laces slightly undone as if someone had removed them in haste or reverence. There were no footprints leading away, no drag marks, no blood, nothing but boots and a silence so profound it made the guards step back, their breath held tight in their chests. It was as though the man had dissolved into the fog or been lifted out of the world by something that left no trace behind. The officers in charge demanded explanations, but none came. Some guards claimed they had seen a figure moving deeper into the woods, tall and pale, but when pressed, each recanted the story, unable to justify what their minds had conjured. Others insisted the prisoner had escaped, though no one could explain how a man in chains could disappear without sound, without tracks, without resistance. The boots were taken as evidence, placed inside a crate that rattled ominously with every movement. Yet even in storage, they seemed out of place, too heavy with meaning. Soldiers avoided looking at them, uncomfortable with the sensation that the leather seemed to breathe faintly, expanding and contracting like the chest of a sleeping man. A few swore they smelled the forest on them, not the clean scent of pine, but something older, something damp, dark, and patient. In the following days, rumors spread like cracks splitting across frozen glass. Some swore that 239 had been taken by partisans using hidden tunnels. Others whispered of experimental disappearances, secret programs designed to make prisoners vanish without a trace. And a few The ones who stayed silent the longest confessed quietly that the forest had taken him, that there were things hiding between the trees that answered to no army. The official report stated that prisoner 239 escaped during a transfer, his whereabouts unknown. The boots were the only physical remnant of his existence, yet the men who had been there never believed the escape story. They carried the memory of that morning like a shadow stitched beneath their skin, a reminder of the cold fog, the sudden emptiness, the silence. As the war ended, and they dispersed across the ruins of Europe, some kept the story buried deep inside, while others spoke of it late at night, their voices trembling slightly as they described the moment when a man simply ceased to be. And as this first part draws to its quiet close, if you wish to walk deeper with me into the darkness of this disappearance, let your presence linger. Consider subscribing to the channel, ensuring you never step away from the shadows awaiting in the next chapter of this unsettling journey. The boots were sent to a holding depot west of Breslau, stored in a wooden crate among piles of abandoned uniforms, dog tags, and evidence logs that no one cared to examine. The war was dying, and bureaucracy was dissolving faster than the ice on the riverbanks. Yet somehow, the crate containing the boots refused to disappear into the flood of forgotten artifacts. It was marked with a red triangle and the initials SR, though no one in the depot could recall what those letters meant. Each night, the watchmen stationed near the evidence room swore they heard soft scraping noises, like something shifting gently inside the crate. At first they dismissed it as rats, or the groaning of the structure under cold wind. But one night, when the temperature dropped below freezing, one of the guards followed the sound and found the crate slightly open, though the latch had not been touched. Inside, the boots stood upright on their own, faintly damp, their soles dark with something that wasn't mud. The guard who found them was a man named Dietrich Weber, a veteran who had long since stopped believing in anything beyond the next ration and the next sunrise. But that night, as he stared at the boots, he felt something staring back. The air thickened, pressing against his skin, and a low vibration trembled through the floorboards beneath his feet. Dietrich reached out, intending to close the crate, but froze when he saw faint impressions forming in the dust, boot prints, appearing one by one, leading away from the box and across the concrete floor. They stopped at the far wall and vanished as abruptly as they had begun. His breath came in sharp bursts. He stumbled backward, sealing the crate with trembling hands and locking the room behind him. By morning, his report was ignored, filed under combat exhaustion, and the boots were relocated again, this time to a facility on the outskirts of Dresden for further cataloging. Weeks later, Dresden burned. During the chaotic firestorm that consumed the city, nearly every building connected to the military archives was reduced to molten ash. Yet in the ruins of that particular storage facility, one small section of the basement remained remarkably untouched. Rescue crews discovered it days later, buried beneath twisted beams and scorched debris. Inside, amid the suffocating smell of char and chemicals, stood a single metal shelf that had survived the inferno. Upon it sat the same crate, blackened but intact. When the rescuers pried it open, they recoiled. The boots were pristine, unburned, the leather gleaming faintly as though freshly polished. Even stranger, the inner lining was warm, almost pulsing with residual heat, as if someone had just taken them off. Word of the discovery spread among surviving officers, some of whom recognized the serial number on the accompanying tag. The name Prisoner 239 returned to whispers. A few archivists insisted the boots be destroyed, fearing contamination or worse. But the order never came. Instead, a small group of scientists, remnants of a research division relocated from Silesia, requested permission to study the object. The boots were moved once again, this time under escort, to a hidden compound deep in the Ore Mountains, where many secret wartime projects had already begun to vanish under the weight of surrender. It was in that underground facility that the real story began to take shape. The lead researcher, Dr. Carl Hahn, kept meticulous records, though most would later vanish from official archives. In his surviving notes, he describes the boots as anomalous artifacts of indeterminate origin. Hahn's tone oscillated between scientific curiosity and barely restrained dread. He noted that the leather, when exposed to light, absorbed it unnaturally fast, producing faint heat. When placed in total darkness, the boots emitted a low-frequency hum that caused nearby instruments to malfunction. On one occasion, a lab assistant left them overnight in a sealed chamber and returned to find the boots several inches away from their original position. Hahn dismissed it as human error, yet he began locking his office door even during the day. As days passed, reports of strange occurrences grew. Researchers complained of whispers in the ventilation system, rhythmic tapping noises, and an unshakable sense of being observed. Hahn recorded that one of his colleagues, a linguist named Vogel, swore he heard words within the hum, a fragmented German phrase repeating endlessly, something akin to, "Ich bin noch hier," I am still here. Another assistant claimed that when she stared too long at the boots, she saw faint outlines of legs continuing upward into nothingness, as if a figure stood invisibly above them. The experiments intensified. The boots were subjected to chemical tests, heat, even controlled electrical currents. Nothing altered their composition. The more they were examined, the more erratic the team became. One night, in March 1945, an explosion was reported at the compound. The official explanation cited a boiler malfunction, though Hahn's private journal tells another story. His final entry, dated the night before the incident, reads, "He is here again. We heard him walking in the corridor, though the boots remain in containment. The sound passes through walls, through flesh. I believe it seeks reunion with what it lost." No bodies were ever recovered from that section of the facility. Only the boots, once again untouched, were found standing in the corridor outside Hahn's office, their soles wet with something that glistened darkly under the lantern light. They were transported one last time by retreating forces to a bunker near Munich, then vanished entirely when the Allies entered the area weeks later. Every record, every file, every witness either disappeared or retracted their statements. Only fragments of Hahn's journal survived, later discovered in a crate, stored under the false name Wehrmacht Medical Supplies. After the war, a British intelligence unit investigating Nazi research stumbled upon references to Project Nachtläufer, the Night Walker, mentioned in decrypted transmissions from early 1945. The documents linked the project to an effort to manipulate human presence through spatial displacement experiments, using prisoners as unwilling test subjects. The description of one subject, male, 30 to 40, listed as 239, matched the vanished prisoner. No official confirmation was ever released, but among the agents who handled the case, a rumor persisted that something from those tests survived the fall of the Reich, something that moved silently between the remnants of burned-out towns, searching for what had once been its own form. In the years that followed, scattered reports emerged across Central Europe. Farmers claiming to hear footsteps at night along empty roads, lone soldiers describing shapes in the fog that left boot prints, but no bodies. In each account, the prints ended abruptly, as if the walker had been swallowed mid-step. Sometimes the witnesses said they heard a man whispering nearby, a voice tired but deliberate, repeating the same words Han had written. "I am still here." Somewhere beneath all this a story tried to be forgotten, but objects have memories, and memory, when bound to loss, becomes its own kind of haunting. The boots of prisoner 239 continued to move across decades, unclaimed by history, following trails no one could map. As the silence of 1945 thickened and the world tried to rebuild itself, some survivors whispered that war never truly ends. It merely changes form, spreading through time like smoke that refuses to disperse. If you are still listening in the quiet, stay with me through what follows. The story only deepens from here, and the shadows are patient. If you want to keep descending with me into this darkness, subscribe now. Your presence keeps the echoes alive for what comes next. In the spring of 1946, long after the front lines had dissolved into silence, a British recovery unit operating near the Bavarian border stumbled upon a partially collapsed tunnel system beneath what had once been a supply depot. The air was stale with rot and rust, and the ground was layered with ash and frost. At first, the men assumed it was just another abandoned munitions cache, the kind that dotted every forest and hillside in the shattered remains of Germany. But inside the main chamber, beneath a thick crust of soot and debris, they found an iron door welded shut from the outside. The welds were crude, frantic, done in haste, perhaps to seal something within. Etched faintly into the metal were the letters SAR, the same mark that had appeared on the crate holding the boots months earlier. The team cut the door open after hours of grinding and hammering. When the final piece gave way, a wave of cold air spilled out, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and something faintly metallic, like old blood. Their lanterns flickered as if touched by a sudden wind, though no draft should have existed underground. Inside, the chamber was nearly empty, except for a single table, a few broken glass containers, and a pile of papers scattered across the floor. But at the center of the room, resting neatly on a small wooden stool, stood a pair of boots. The officer in charge, Lieutenant Peter Hargreaves, noted in his field report that the boots appeared untouched by decay, their soles perfectly intact, despite the surrounding corrosion. He described a feeling of containment, as though the entire space had been built for the purpose of keeping the boots in, rather than keeping intruders out. When one of his men, a corporal named Finch, reached out to inspect them, the temperature of the room dropped sharply, causing frost to bloom across the walls. Finch drew his hand back with a shout. The leather had burned his skin, leaving behind a red imprint shaped like the outline of a heel. That night, as the men camped near the entrance, strange noises echoed from the tunnel below. The rhythmic pattern of boots striking stone carried through the silence, deliberate and slow. Some of the men assumed it was water dripping from the ceiling, but Finch swore the sound followed a distinct cadence. 2 steps, pause, 2 steps, pause, as though someone, or something, was pacing back and forth in the dark. The next morning, Finch was gone. His bedroll was neatly folded, his rifle leaned against the tunnel wall, and only a single muddy boot print led away from the campfire, vanishing a few meters later into hard ground. Hargreaves ordered a search of the surrounding woods, but they found no sign of the corporal. What they did find, however, was unsettling in its precision. At the edge of a nearby stream, lying side by side in the mud, was Finch's pair of military boots. They were still warm, their insides damp with condensation, as if someone had just taken them off. Hargreaves recognized the pattern immediately. It mirrored the account he had read weeks earlier in a debriefing about the lost prisoner convoy from 45. He didn't believe in coincidences anymore. The boots from the tunnel were crated up and sent to the Allied archives in Nuremberg. The crate was sealed with wax and labeled Recovered Artifact, No Contamination Risk, though one of the archivists later confessed that the man overseeing the documentation insisted on performing a short prayer before signing the papers. When questioned why, the officer simply said, "It's not about God. It's about keeping the dead where they belong." For several months, the boots remained in storage, untouched, filed away among hundreds of other relics from the war. But the archivists began noticing disturbances, catalog sheets misplaced, equipment humming at night, temperature shifts that made breath visible in rooms where it should not have been. One night, during a blackout caused by a storm, a night watchman reported seeing a figure standing at the end of the corridor, tall, motionless, half-shrouded in shadow. When he shone his flashlight toward it, the beam passed through what looked like empty air, but the sound that followed froze him in place, the soft, steady rhythm of footsteps echoing closer, though no one was visible. The next morning, the power returned. The watchman's flashlight was found lying on the floor, its lens cracked. There were 2 parallel lines of wet boot prints leading from the corridor into the archive room, each step darker than the last, ending at a shelf marked Recovered Evidence, Eastern Territories. When the archivists opened the crate containing the boots, they found it empty. For months afterward, no one spoke openly of the incident. Files were rewritten, logs corrected, blame redirected toward human error. But whispers spread among the guards and clerks that sometimes, after midnight, they heard someone walking between the shelves, a faint scuffing that came and went like breathing. And those who dared to listen too closely claimed that if you stood long enough in the dark, the steps would stop behind you, and a voice would whisper, "Ich bin noch hier." By 1948, all documentation regarding the recovered boots had been classified and locked under Section 12 of the Special Research Division, a small department tasked with cataloging psychological warfare relics. Their reports described the object only as anomalous footwear associated with a vanished subject. The terminology was careful, clinical, meant to strip the event of its terror. Yet within the private correspondences of one officer, Captain Roland Strauss, a different tone emerged. In a letter never meant to be seen publicly, he wrote, "We are not studying remnants of war. We are guarding a wound, and the wound still bleeds." After the Nuremberg trials ended and the archives were consolidated, the boots were said to have been moved again. Destination unknown. Some claimed they were buried with other unstable artifacts in an unmarked bunker deep beneath a U.S. facility. Others said the Soviets intercepted the shipment, that the boots were seen in a Moscow laboratory years later. No proof exists for either claim. But what does exist is the pattern. The same story told again and again, across borders and decades. A man disappears. Only his boots remain. The air turns cold. The silence thickens. By the mid-1950s, sightings of the Walker began to surface in refugee camps and border towns. Survivors described hearing footsteps outside their tents on nights when the fog rolled in, heavy and pale. Some said they saw the faint outline of a figure pacing just beyond the lamplight, barely visible, like the shimmer of heat on cold glass. Others spoke of finding boot prints the next morning, pressed deep into the earth, leading nowhere. The stories varied in detail, but not in essence. The walker left no trail, no sound of breathing, no reflection in water, only the sense of presence, heavy and watching. When the British unit's surviving members gathered years later, Hargreaves among them, they spoke reluctantly of the 1946 tunnel discovery. Each described a recurring dream, the same one, unchanged over time. They would be walking down a narrow corridor, the sound of boots behind them growing louder with each step, until they turned and saw nothing. Then the silence. Always the silence. Hargreaves confessed that he sometimes woke with the smell of damp leather in his room, though he hadn't owned boots in years. He died in his sleep in 1958, his wife finding his body seated upright by the window, bare feet resting on the floor. Muddy footprints led to his bed and stopped there. The official cause, heart failure. The truth, never spoken. If you have followed this far, if you still hear the echo of those steps behind the words, remember, stories like this are not just told, they wait. They persist in the quiet places where memory and fear overlap. And as we move into what comes next, understand that the line between history and haunting grows thinner with every retelling. Stay with me in the dark. Subscribe before we descend further, so you do not lose your way when the lights begin to fade. By the turn of the 1960s, Europe was rebuilding faster than it could remember. Cities that had been flattened were now sprouting glass towers, and the silence of the ruins had been paved over by the hum of new machines. But memory is not so easily buried. Beneath the surface, in the places where the soil still tasted of ash, the war's remnants remained restless. In 1961, a French historian named Etienne Morel began collecting stories from displaced families who had survived in the forests of Silesia during the last months of the war. His research focused on folklore born from trauma. Ghosts, disappearances, echoes of violence turned into local legend. That's when he first encountered mention of L'Homme des Bottes, the man of the boots. Villagers described him as a shadow that walked without sound, a presence that followed the last columns of prisoners retreating westward in 45. To some, he was an omen, appearing before deaths, vanishing before dawn. To others, he was punishment itself, a spirit condemned to walk until the last witness forgot his name. Morel, a skeptic by nature, assumed these were metaphors shaped by grief. But one testimony unsettled him. An elderly woman from a hamlet near Görlitz claimed that weeks after the front collapsed, she had found a pair of boots outside her door. She said she'd heard knocking through the night, 3 times, always 3. And in the morning the boots were there, perfectly aligned, their leather damp as if from mist. Out of pity or fear, she took them inside, cleaned them, and set them by her fire. That night, she awoke to footsteps circling her house. Slow, deliberate, measured, she waited for them to stop. They never did. When Morel returned to the site decades later, the house was gone, burned in an unexplained fire. Only the stone foundation remained, half buried in wild grass. Yet near what had once been the threshold, he found 2 faint depressions in the soil, shaped unmistakably like footprints, one slightly deeper than the other, as if the person had been carrying weight or dragging something unseen behind. He didn't tell anyone what he saw, but in his notes he wrote, "It feels less like I am researching history, and more like history is researching me." Over the next 2 years, Morel became obsessed. He traced the legend across borders, finding near-identical stories in Poland, Austria, even Belgium. The figure was always the same: tall, silent, faceless, appearing at the edge of light before vanishing into fog, always accompanied by footprints, always leaving the same emptiness behind. And in every story, someone went missing soon after. When asked what the sound of the footsteps was like, one witness replied, "Like someone walking just behind you, but slower." The deeper Morell dug, the more he noticed patterns in the archives of the occupation years, missing persons cases that mirrored one another with eerie precision. Each began with a report of footsteps in isolated areas, followed by unexplained vanishings, and ending with the discovery of boots left behind. The files spanned from 1945 to 1960, each stamped with different national seals, yet the handwriting and phrasing seemed strangely similar, as if the same person, or the same hand, had written them all. Morell sent a selection of these cases to his colleague in London, a linguist named Dr. Evelyn Clark, who confirmed his suspicion. The syntax and structure of the reports were consistent with a single author, but the name signed at the bottom of each file belonged to different officers, some confirmed dead years earlier. That was when the correspondence between Morell and Clark began to take on a darker tone. In one letter, Clark described hearing footsteps in her archive room late at night while reviewing the documents. She dismissed it at first as her imagination, but the next morning she found a thin layer of mud on the floor, drying in streaks that resembled boot prints. She wrote that she had tried to photograph them, but the negatives developed blank. Morell's reply was brief. "Do not look for him. He looks back." In early 1963, Morell vanished. His apartment in Lyon was found undisturbed, except for one detail. The wooden floor near his desk bore a pair of wet footprints, leading from the study to the balcony. The balcony door was locked from the inside. His shoes were neatly placed beside his bed. He had left his research notes stacked on the table, topped with a single photograph. It showed a fog-covered forest, the edges blurred, and in the background, barely visible, a figure standing between the trees, wearing what looked like military boots. Clark published their incomplete findings later that year under the title Echoes of the Vanished, Folklore of the Occupation Era, but she omitted every reference to the boots, claiming privately that the subject had become too real. Yet witnesses from that period recalled her growing increasingly paranoid, refusing to stay in one room for long, her footsteps always echoing against the floor as if she feared silence itself. In 1965, her neighbors reported hearing heavy footsteps in her flat while she was away. When she returned, she found her doormat soaked, though it hadn't rained in days. Within months, she abandoned her academic work and fled to the countryside. No one saw her again after 1966. By the end of the decade, the legend of the walker had transformed. It was no longer just a remnant of war. It had become something that fed on memory. The stories followed people who researched it, as though the act of remembering gave it strength. Archivists, historians, even soldiers began to refer to the phenomenon not as a ghost, but as an infection. One intelligence report from 1968 described it in chilling terms. The subject appears to propagate through documentation. Those who read the accounts experience similar auditory or visual manifestations within weeks. Recommend destruction of all related material. But the destruction never came. Governments changed, archives merged, and old files were misplaced instead of erased. Somewhere among them the boots waited. Years later, in 1972, a museum curator in Prague discovered a sealed crate labeled simply Property of the British Army, 1946. The wood had rotted around the hinges, and the tag had nearly faded to dust. Inside, resting on a bed of discolored cloth, were the boots, untouched, unaged, the leather dark as wet stone. She thought them an unremarkable relic until she placed them in storage overnight and returned the next morning to find the display room colder than the rest of the building. The lights flickered, and faint condensation marked the glass. The boots had shifted slightly on their stand, one toe pointing toward the exit. Visitors soon began to complain of hearing footsteps following them through the exhibit, though no one was ever seen. When the museum staff tried to move the boots to a new location, the air turned so cold that one of the workers collapsed, his breath freezing mid-sentence. After that, the curator ordered the display permanently closed. The boots were locked in a basement vault, sealed behind reinforced glass. They have never been catalogued in the museum's public records. Some say the curator resigned shortly after, others that she vanished the following winter. But among those who remain, one detail is always repeated. Sometimes, late at night, the security cameras capture condensation forming on the inside of the glass, spelling faint words before fading, letters that resemble "I am still here." And if you are still listening now, still following this trail through the decades, understand this. What began as a disappearance has become something far older. A persistence, a memory that refuses to stay buried. As we move deeper into the final corridors of this story, remember to keep your light close. Subscribe now so the next descent finds you ready, because the silence is almost upon us. By the early 1980s, the Cold War had drawn new lines across an old continent, and with those lines came new silences. Bunkers that had once been filled with soldiers were now filled with secrets. Forgotten tunnels were sealed, archives reclassified, and history began to fold in on itself, layer after layer. But even buried things breathe, and some echoes refused to fade. In the spring of 1983, a Polish construction team digging near the remains of an abandoned military complex outside Wrocław uncovered a reinforced steel door beneath 6 meters of soil. It bore no insignia, no markings, only a small brass plate engraved with 3 faint letters, NLF. The workers assumed it was an old ammunition storage vault, but when they cut through the corroded locks, they found a stairwell descending into the dark. The air below was dry and still, almost preserved. Their flashlights revealed narrow hallways lined with peeling paint and rusted metal, and at the far end, a single room sealed behind a thick glass partition. Inside, perfectly centered on the floor, stood a pair of boots. They looked impossibly intact, as though placed there moments before. The foreman, a man named Kowalski, later said that the sight filled him with unease. The boots seemed to exist in sharper focus than everything else around them, like a photograph too vivid to belong to the same world. When the crew returned the next day to document the find, the boots were gone. The door to the sealed room remained locked from the inside. Only a faint layer of frost clung to the glass, shaped like a single hand pressed against it from within. That was when the officials arrived, men in plain uniforms who spoke little and asked no questions. They ordered the workers to leave, confiscated all photographs, and closed off the site under military jurisdiction. Within a week, the entire structure was filled with concrete. But Kowalski couldn't forget what he'd seen. He began to have dreams of narrow corridors filled with footsteps, always coming closer but never arriving. In the dreams, the sound of boots echoed from every direction, surrounding him, pressing closer until he woke with his ears ringing and the faint scent of damp leather in the air. He told his wife that sometimes, when he looked out the window before dawn, he saw a figure standing near the edge of their property, still as a statue, barely outlined by the fog. Then one morning, he didn't come home from work. His co-workers found his truck, parked by the roadside, engine still running, driver's door open. In the passenger seat lay his work gloves and a single empty boot print pressed into the dust. A week later, his wife reported hearing footsteps inside the house at night, slow, deliberate, circling the bed. No one else was there. That same year, an internal document surfaced within the Soviet archives, later leaked decades after the regime's collapse. It was classified under Phenomena of Unverified Origin, and among the case files was a single entry titled Subject 239. The report described persistent manifestations of locomotor acoustics in sealed facilities, particularly near artifacts recovered from the German research division Nachtläufer. The language was clinical, but between the lines it was clear that the phenomenon terrified those who studied it. A handwritten note in the margin read, "Containment impossible. Presence migrates through documentation." In 1986, the Chernobyl disaster struck, and within the chaos of that radioactive silence, the trail nearly vanished again. But a former technician stationed near Pripyat later claimed that in the weeks before the meltdown, workers had reported footsteps echoing through the underground service tunnels. At first, they blamed the noise on loose pipes or distant machinery, but one night, 2 engineers followed the sound into a corridor that ended abruptly in a sealed wall. They said the footsteps continued behind the wall for several minutes, pacing back and forth, before fading completely. When the city was evacuated, some of those tunnels were flooded, others collapsed. But to this day, explorers who enter the exclusion zone tell stories of hearing boots striking concrete deep below the ground, steady, slow, patient. They call it the soldier who never left. The legend spread across Eastern Europe through whispers, radio chatter, and drunken confessions. Truck drivers along the old wartime routes told of picking up lone passengers in military coats who vanished before reaching their destinations, leaving only mud on the seats. Night guards in border facilities swore they heard the sound of someone walking behind them during patrols, even when they were alone. One Romanian officer wrote in his journal, "It feels like history itself is walking beside us, wearing the skin of the past." By the end of the decade, the boots were no longer just a myth. They had become a signal, a warning of thin places where the veil between memory and the present began to tear. Scholars and occultists alike started referring to the phenomenon as the residual march. The term appeared in fringe journals, always attached to incidents involving sudden cold, unexplained disappearances, or traces of wet footprints appearing indoors. Some described it as a curse carried by the remnants of war, others as a living echo, something left behind when the human body perishes but the act of walking continues. And then in 1989, as the Berlin Wall crumbled, a new story surfaced. Amid the chaos of the collapse, workers dismantling a section of the wall near Treptower Park discovered a narrow cavity between the concrete panels. Inside was a rusted metal box. When opened, it revealed a pair of boots, black leather, pristine, soles stamped with the faint imprint of an old Reich insignia. Witnesses claimed that the boots were warm to the touch, though the air was below freezing. No one could explain how they had been sealed inside for over 40 years without aging. The discovery was quietly removed from public record, and the boots were reportedly transported by an unmarked van to an unknown facility near Potsdam. The driver of that vehicle was later found dead in his apartment, seated upright at his kitchen table. His shoes were missing. By the dawn of the 1990s, reports began to shift westward, to the United Kingdom, to France, even to the United States. Academics who had studied the Nachtläufer files started to vanish, one by one, their last correspondences always mentioning the same phrase, "I think I hear him." In an interview decades later, a retired intelligence officer confessed that the investigation into these disappearances was eventually abandoned, not because of lack of evidence, but because anyone who pursued the case long enough began to experience the phenomenon themselves. "It wasn't that we couldn't find him," the officer said. "It was that he found us." And still, the boots remained unaccounted for. Somewhere across the vast archives of the modern world, sealed behind glass, or buried beneath concrete, or perhaps walking again through fog-thick woods, the remnants of Prisoner 239 continued their silent pilgrimage through time. The man who disappeared in 1945 had become more than a ghost. He had become the sound that memory makes when it refuses to die. If you've followed every echo so far, if you've felt that quiet chill just behind the words, stay close. The end of this path lies ahead, but endings are rarely kind. Like this video if the story still lingers with you, if the footsteps haven't yet faded. Subscribe before we reach the final chapter. What waits there does not want to be alone. By the time the new century arrived, the world had learned to drown its ghosts in light. The ruins of Europe had become cities of glass and neon, reflections swallowing reflections until history seemed to vanish behind its own brilliance. Yet beneath that polished surface, the old wounds still pulsed quietly, buried in archives, in forgotten basements, in the damp corridors of museums that no one visited anymore. It was in one of those basements, in the winter of 2004, that the boots surfaced again. The museum stood on the outskirts of Dresden, a rebuilt structure standing on the bones of an older one, lost to fire. Its curator, a man named Jonas Adler, had devoted his life to preserving artifacts of the war, uniforms, medals, photographs, fragments of things that had survived destruction. He was precise, cautious, respectful. When he received a sealed package from an anonymous donor marked only Recovered Object, 1945, he assumed it was another forgotten relic. Inside, wrapped in aged linen, were the boots. They looked almost ordinary, except for their weight, a subtle heaviness that seemed to pull at the air around them. The leather was cold, yet not stiff, and the faint scent of damp forest lingered in the wrapping cloth. Adler logged them without ceremony, placing them in the restricted storage room deep beneath the museum. He planned to study them later, perhaps prepare a small exhibit on the anonymous lives lost in the final days of the war. But that night, as he closed the building, he heard the echo of footsteps behind him in the hall. At first he thought it was his own, bouncing off the walls, but the rhythm was wrong. His steps were quick, nervous. The echo was slow, deliberate, one beat behind. He turned. No one was there. The following morning he found condensation on the storage room door. His colleagues dismissed it as a temperature imbalance from the underground humidity, but Adler knew better. He began recording sounds at night, setting up a small tape recorder near the storage area. The first few nights captured nothing but the hum of the air system. Then, on the 6th night, the recording changed. At precisely 2:17 a.m., the tape picked up the distinct sound of footsteps, steady, measured, approaching the microphone, pausing, then retreating. After 20 seconds of silence, A faint whisper followed, low and strained, repeating in German, "Ich bin noch hier." He tried to rationalize it. Perhaps an echo, a security guard, a prank. But the voice on the tape wasn't familiar. It was hoarse, distant, hollow, as though spoken through a wall of water. Adler listened to it again and again, until the whisper began to feel less like sound and more like breath. That night, he locked the tape away. By the end of the week, he stopped sleeping altogether. One evening, he noticed the boots had shifted slightly on the shelf, only a few centimeters, but enough to make his pulse quicken. He asked the staff if anyone had moved them. Everyone denied touching the display. He considered calling the police, but how does one report that an artifact might be moving on its own? Instead, he began sealing the storage door with chalk marks every night. For 3 nights, the marks remained undisturbed. On the 4th, one of the chalk lines was broken, smudged by something that looked like a fingerprint. Then the lights began to flicker. The sensors malfunctioned, and every morning the air grew colder in that room, as if something was drawing the warmth away. Adler's journal entries from those weeks became increasingly erratic. At first, they were scientific observations, possible vibration interference due to underground ventilation. Then they became personal, dreams of a man without a face, walking in fog, the sound of boots beside my bed. Finally, they turned desperate. He is awake again. He knows I'm listening. In March 2005, Adler disappeared. His apartment showed no sign of struggle, only an overturned chair and a half-finished cup of tea. His shoes were still by the door. The museum closed for renovation shortly afterward, officially due to structural repairs. But those who worked there whispered that at night, from the street outside, one could still hear faint footsteps pacing within the shuttered halls. Over the years that followed, the story spread in fragments through online forums and obscure research blogs. Paranormal investigators tried to trace the object's origins, linking it to the wartime disappearances, to Nachtläufer, to the recurring pattern of vanishings that followed the boots across decades. But each investigation ended the same way: corrupted files, lost recordings, researchers vanishing mid-project. One blogger, writing under the name The Archivist, posted an entry in 2011 claiming to have located the last known crate containing the boots, stored in a private collection somewhere in Bavaria. His final post was a single photograph, blurry, out of focus, showing what looked like 2 black shapes on a tiled floor. And the caption beneath it read, "He walks again." The account was deleted within hours, and yet the story persisted. Witnesses began to appear across Europe and beyond. Security guards, night shift workers, archivists, each told of the same thing: footsteps in empty corridors, the sound of someone approaching, pausing just out of sight. Some described the faint smell of damp earth, others a whisper repeating words they couldn't understand. But all spoke of a single, shared sensation, the sense that the air was heavier afterward, as if the world itself had inhaled and forgotten how to exhale. By the 2010s, reports began surfacing far from Europe. A military museum in Virginia, a historical exhibit in Canada, a private collector's estate in Argentina. Each incident followed the same pattern: objects of unknown origin arriving unannounced, strange cold spreading through storage rooms, equipment failing, and then the sound of boots, always the boots. In 2018, a museum guard in Warsaw recorded CCTV footage of a corridor where the motion sensors had triggered at 2:03 a.m., The camera caught a brief flicker of movement, two wet footprints appearing one after another across the floor, leading toward the exit and vanishing mid-step. The footage was quietly removed from circulation, but fragments of it leaked online. Grainy, low resolution, impossible to verify. Still, those who watched claimed to hear something faint beneath the static, a whispering voice repeating, "I am still here." What remains now is less a mystery than a contagion. The disappearance of prisoner 239 is no longer confined to a single moment in 1945. It has become a loop, a pattern repeating across time, sustained by those who remember it. Each retelling feeds it. Each listener becomes a witness. Perhaps that is why you are still here, listening now, because something in the silence between words keeps moving, slow and patient, searching for the sound of another step. And maybe that's the final truth. Maybe he never vanished at all. Maybe he's been walking this entire time, through our stories, through our voices, waiting for someone to listen long enough to hear him pass by. So if you find yourself alone tonight, and you hear footsteps that do not match your own, don't turn. Don't look. The moment you do, the silence will end, and the story will begin again. If this tale still lingers in your thoughts, if the air feels a little colder now, let it be known. Like this video, subscribe, and leave your mark in the comments, because even in darkness, remembrance is a kind of light. And as the last echoes fade, remember this. The war ended long ago, but some soldiers never stopped walking. By the time the new century arrived, the world had learned to drown its ghosts in light. The ruins of Europe had become cities of glass and neon, reflections swallowing reflections until history seemed to vanish behind its own brilliance. Yet beneath that polished surface, the old wounds still pulsed quietly, buried in archives, in forgotten basements, in the damp corridors of museums that no one visited anymore. It was in one of those basements, in the winter of 2000, that the boots surfaced again. The museum stood on the outskirts of Dresden, a rebuilt structure standing on the bones of an older one, lost to fire. Its curator, a man named Jonas Adler, had devoted his life to preserving artifacts of the war. Uniforms, medals, photographs, fragments of things that had survived destruction. He was precise, cautious, respectful. When he received a sealed package from an anonymous donor marked "Only Recovered Object, 1945, he assumed it was another forgotten relic. Inside, wrapped in aged linen, were the boots. They looked almost ordinary, except for their weight, a subtle heaviness that seemed to pull at the air around them. The leather was cold, yet not stiff, and the faint scent of damp forest lingered in the wrapping cloth. Adler logged them without ceremony, placing them in the restricted storage room deep beneath the museum. He planned to study them later, perhaps prepare a small exhibit on the anonymous lives lost in the final days of the war. But that night, as he closed the building, he heard the echo of footsteps behind him in the hall. At first he thought it was his own, bouncing off the walls, but the rhythm was wrong. His steps were quick, nervous. The echo was slow, deliberate, one beat behind. He turned. No one was there. The following morning he found condensation on the storage room door. His colleagues dismissed it as a temperature imbalance from the underground humidity, but Adler knew better. He began recording sounds at night, setting up a small tape recorder near the storage area. The first few nights captured nothing but the hum of the air system. Then, on the sixth night, the recording changed. At precisely 2:17 a.m., the tape picked up the distinct sound of footsteps. steady, measured, approaching the microphone, pausing, then retreating. After 20 seconds of silence, a faint whisper followed, low and strained, repeating in German, "Ich bin noch hier." He tried to rationalize it, perhaps an echo, a security guard, a prank. But the voice on the tape wasn't familiar. It was hoarse, distant, hollow, as though spoken through a wall of water. Adler listened to it again and again, until the whisper began to feel less like sound and more like breath. That night, he locked the tape away. By the end of the week, he stopped sleeping altogether. One evening he noticed the boots had shifted slightly on the shelf, only a few centimeters, but enough to make his pulse quicken. He asked the staff if anyone had moved them. Everyone denied touching the display. He considered calling the police, but how does one report that an artifact might be moving on its own? Instead, he began sealing the storage door with chalk marks every night. For 3 nights, the marks remained undisturbed. On the 4th, one of the chalk lines was broken, smudged by something that looked like a fingerprint. Then the lights began to flicker. The sensors malfunctioned, and every morning the air grew colder in that room, as if something was drawing the warmth away. Adler's journal entries from those weeks became increasingly erratic. At first they were scientific observations, possible vibration interference due to underground ventilation. Then they became personal, dreams of a man without a face, walking in fog, the sound of boots beside my bed. Finally they turned desperate. He is awake again. He knows I'm listening. In March 2005, Adler disappeared. His apartment showed no sign of struggle, only an overturned chair and a half-finished cup of tea. His shoes were still by the door. The museum closed for renovation shortly afterward, officially due to structural repairs. But those who worked there whispered that at night, from the street outside, one could still hear faint footsteps pacing within the shuttered halls. Over the years that followed, the story spread in fragments through online forums and obscure research blogs. Paranormal investigators tried to trace the object's origins, linking it to the wartime disappearances, to Nachtläufer, to the recurring pattern of vanishings that followed the boots across decades. But each investigation ended the same way: corrupted files, lost recordings, researchers vanishing mid-project. One blogger, writing under the name The Archivist, posted an entry in 2011 claiming to have located the last known crate containing the boots, stored in a private collection somewhere in Bavaria. His final post was a single photograph, blurry, out of focus, showing what looked like 2 black shapes on a tiled floor, and the caption beneath it read, "He walks again." The account was deleted within hours, and yet the story persisted. Witnesses began to appear across Europe and beyond: security guards, night shift workers, archivists. Each told of the same thing: footsteps in empty corridors, the sound of someone approaching, pausing just out of sight. Some described the faint smell of damp earth, others a whisper repeating words they couldn't understand. But all spoke of a single, shared sensation, the sense that the air was heavier afterward, as if the world itself had inhaled and forgotten how to exhale. By the 2010s, reports began surfacing far from Europe. A military museum in Virginia, a historical exhibit in Canada, a private collector's estate in Argentina. Each incident followed the same pattern: objects of unknown origin arriving unannounced, strange cold spreading through storage rooms, equipment failing, and then the sound of boots, always the boots. In 2018, a museum guard in Warsaw recorded CCTV footage of a corridor where the motion sensors had triggered at 2:03 a.m. The camera caught a brief flicker of movement, 2 wet footprints appearing one after another across the floor, leading toward the exit and vanishing mid-step. The footage was quietly removed from circulation, but fragments of it leaked online. Grainy, low resolution, impossible to verify. Still, those who watched claimed to hear something faint beneath the static, a whispering voice repeating, "I am still here." What remains now is less a mystery than a contagion. The disappearance of prisoner 239 is no longer confined to a single moment in 1945. It has become a loop, a pattern repeating across time, sustained by those who remember it. Each retelling feeds it. Each listener becomes a witness. Perhaps that is why you are still here, listening now, because something in the silence between words keeps moving, slow and patient, searching for the sound of another step. And maybe that's the final truth. Maybe he never vanished at all. Maybe he's been walking this entire time, through our stories, through our voices, waiting for someone to listen long enough to hear him pass by. So if you find yourself alone tonight, and you hear footsteps that do not match your own, don't turn. Don't look. The moment you do, the silence will end, and the story will begin again. If this tale still lingers in your thoughts, if the air feels a little colder now, let it be known. Like this video, subscribe, and leave your mark in the comments, because even in darkness, remembrance is a kind of light. And as the last echoes fade, remember this. The war ended long ago, but some soldiers never stopped walking.